Nice. Okay, well, it is now 10 o'clock, and I will start off with quoting some people who wrote about his other book called Correction Lines that I have here. Donald Worster, professor of American history from the University of Kansas, wrote that Curt Meine is one of the most thoughtful nature conservationists active in the United States today. In these essays in this book that I'm holding, he takes us from the days of Theodore Roosevelt and Aldo Leopold to the era of international terrorism, skillfully interpreting the past to help us define a conservation ethic for today. Very useful, wise, and necessary book. Now, Curtis was going to talk a bit along those lines, but he gave me the choice, and I thought that as a group we might prefer to hear something a little more current. And so his new title is Community, Conservation, and the Reuse of the Badger Army Ammunition Plant Lands in Sauk County. And several of us have been up there and worked a little bit. I think Charlie Luthen gave us a tour there 3 or 4 years ago. But we had quite a changeover in our attendees. Some of them move on and new people move into town or get interested or turn over 55. And so there is a significant turnover, and I see people here who are been with us only a few months and others several years. So some of you may remember our visits to the area with Charlie Luthen. But it's a delight to have Curt Meine talk with us today. And Curt, you have the floor.
Hey, well, thank you, Richard. Thank you for inviting me to join the PLATO gang. It's been a few years since I've been in a PLATO program, and I know that it's a tough and demanding audience. I do know that. I remember that from prior presentations. Wonderfully engaged group of folks you are. I really appreciate that intro, Richard. I had not thought back on that wonderful Donald Worster endorsement for a long time. He was one of my academic mentors, even though I was not his student. He was certainly one of my inspirations for getting involved in environmental history and conservation work, and one of the truly great academic thinkers, in my view, of our time. And yeah, 2004 or 5, and there's no direct connection here, but I will mention, and if anyone really wants to get into it, in fact, it's correction lines is a land surveying term, and it has to do with how the public land survey was carried out in the 1800s. And in fact, the first correction line in Wisconsin, which is 60 miles north of the Illinois border, actually goes through the Badger Army Ammunition Plant lands. So I'm going to leave it at that's a teaser for you all if you want to get into the fascinating story of land survey lines on the map and on the land and what they've done to our places and our lives. I'm happy to talk about that. But today, as Richard said, we thought we would kind of focus in on a little more detailed story, but one that I'm sure many of you have some connection with in one way or another. In fact, I might ask you right now, even though some of you are not showing yourselves, but how many of you, well, let's see, let's do it this way. How many of you are familiar with the Badger Army Ammunition Plant in general? If you could just remember what it was. All right, there we go. How many of you actually may know someone or have family members or acquaintances who were connected to the plant in one way, workers or whatever? Or is anyone who knew anyone who worked at Badger? If you're from Wisconsin, there's a very good likelihood you would have had a family member working there. There were, at the height of its production in World War II, 12,000 workers. 12,000 workers working around the clock at the Badger plant. And so when I've given talks on Badger over the years, I'll often ask in an audience who had a family member there, and invariably someone puts their hand up. So I'm going to share my screen right away here, and so we can get into it. And for those of you not familiar, I'll give you the background and all that. Okay, so you should see the screen now, and if there's anyone who doesn't see it, well, just have to talk. Okay, here we are. Um, so it's a big story of this place about 30 miles north of Madison, and here in Sauk County between Sauk Prairie and Baraboo. If you've come up to the state park, you have, of course, passed by this landscape, or if you're on your way up to the Dells or wherever. And this, well, in fact, let me do this. Yeah, here's the landscape. This has become my favorite aerial photo. You're looking north from Sauk Prairie area to Baraboo, and in the middle you see that lake, which most people know as Devil's Lake, but I prefer to use the Ho-Chunk Nation term for it, which is De Wakanchunk, the sacred lake, sometimes Spirit Lake, but more accurately, Sacred Lake. We'll come back to that a little bit. But that's the way it looks now, but it certainly did not always look that way. And I'm going to tell you the story of how we went from one of the world's largest military ammunition manufacturing facilities um, to a vision for its reuse that I've been involved in for more than 25 years, actually, probably about 30 years at this point. So a big part of my adult life has been wrapped up in trying to work in this community, because I only live a few miles away, to help transition this place in a positive way. So what I'm going to go through is, this is kind of sums up the whole presentation I'm going to give, how we went from the question of what should be done with this military production facility to a plan that some regarded as a quote rare achievement. That was the lead editorial in the State Journal back 22 years ago now. So it's a complicated, long story. I won't be able to do it all, but I will. Well, yeah, here's just a couple quotes from that article, and I'll pop them up here so you can read them up. But yeah, it took 5 years with many levels of government, many viewpoints emerged, and finally they emerged with a plan that was nothing short of stunning. Wow. Central to the success was the Badger Reuse Committee, on which I served. I was one of the 21 people who was on that committee. And vital to the mission was thoroughness. Every viewpoint got its say. Vital was the realization by most involved that their judgment ought to be enlightened by the greater good. Wow, it's kind of refreshing to read that these days, isn't it? But it was. It was a rare and actually somewhat unpredictable achievement, and surprised as many of us who were involved as it did everyone else, I guess. So how did we do it? How did we get there? That's what I'll be sharing with you today. And here's the basic layout of what I'll do. Again, some of you are a little familiar with Badger and this process, but I'll give you the context and background, talk in some detail about the process we went through back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then why we were able to succeed. And then I'll bring it up to date kind of at the end too, and hopefully plenty of time. If anyone does any questions along the way, feel free to chime in. It sounds like we got plenty of time. And this should go about 30 or 40 minutes, but if you want to ask questions, I'm more than happy to take them as they come up. So on the left of your screen there, you see that red outline of what was the Badger Army Ammunition Plant, created at the outset of World War II, and served to produce components for munitions, propellants, through World War II, reactivated during the Korean conflict, reactivated during the Vietnam War, and then on standby through the remainder of the Cold War up into the 90s, when we had the first Gulf War and it was not activated, which was kind of an indication that the Badger plant was no longer needed for national defense purposes. What you see in the map here in the shaded tan area are the plumes of contaminated groundwater that came out of the lands of the Badger plant moving toward the Wisconsin River Of course, in those decades of production, environmental protections were pretty scarce, and so there was a lot of issues. And so groundwater was kind of the headliner issue, though there were others. And so it was perceived as a dangerous place. And you see up on top, a group called Citizens for Safe Water around Badger actually became active in the 90s to bring attention to the issues of water contamination coming out of the plant. A lot of other things were happening in the late 90s when the plants was decommissioned. So one of them, I'll just mention a few of them. Most of you are, of course, familiar with having driven up Highway 12, but if you're old enough, you'll remember when it was a two-lane highway through the 90s and into 2000. Many of us here in Sauk County were really concerned about what would happen when Highway 12 went four lanes and we feared promote rampant development of land. And that was one of the issues that we thought about, was that when you have actually 7,350 acres of this former military plant, which were open space basically, that we had a chance to protect some space right next to Daywalkenchunk Devil's Lake State Park. So that was a real key element as well in what we were doing. Hold on here. Yeah, okay. But we also had some other things going on at the time. We had, for example, down in Chicago, outside Chicago, there was a sister plant to the Badger plant. It was called the Joliet Army Ammunition Plant. And in 1997, the leaders in Illinois, political leaders, got together to protect it as what is now the Medawin National Tallgrass Prairie. It's only 35, 40 miles from downtown Chicago. Pretty amazing that they were able to seize the opportunity and protect about 20,000 acres of open space that close to Chicago. So it was a high priority. There was a lot of political activity. There was a lot of alignment across parties to move ahead quickly and secure that. And so we had that inspiration for us, but ours was a very different situation. And so yeah, so this is down here. You'll see a letter I got from the congressman in Illinois who had helped that process. So this is what Badger looked like before the buildings were taken down. There were more than 1,400 buildings constructed over its decades of use, most of them at the beginning of World War II, thrown up really quickly, of course, in a crisis situation. But that was part of the legacy of the production years and something we all had to deal with. So I'm going to take you very quickly through the timeline, and I'm not going to read all this, but I want to kind of give you a sense of the flow of events that happened over about a 5-year period, and then I'll go back and explore some of this in detail. So in 1997, the U.S. Department of Defense declared that the Badger plant was no longer needed and it was decommissioned. At that point, a number of us in the conservation community met up at the Crane Foundation and said, well, this is something in our neighborhood that we ought to be thinking of doing. Most of you are familiar with the Crane Foundation up outside Baraboo, I'm sure. So we gathered up our forces and decided that we would go to work, and we created a loose coalition of conservation organizations that I actually was the initial kind of coordinator for. There was an effort to resolve what would happen to Badger through former Congressman Scott Klug. He was the congressman before Tammy Baldwin became congressman and later senator. A lot happened quickly in these years. The Ho-Chunk Nation expressed interest. There was a history group founded to highlight the history of the Badger plant, on and on. But I wanted attention. I'll come back to this with that last item. Mike Mossman, a dear friend of mine. Some of you may know Mike. He's a leading field biologist and naturalist, then working for the DNR, who also grew up in Baraboo and knew this landscape very well. And those bird surveys I'll talk about were critically important. Our little coalition got very busy doing all kinds of things. I won't name all these things, but just did all kinds of community activities here in Sauk County and also Dane County. In particular, one I didn't mention here was we were out on the farmers market in Madison for at least a year or two every Saturday, just drawing attention to this landscape and its potential. We did again continuing public education activities in 2000. That Scott Klug task force failed. I'll talk about that, I think, in a bit here, but it failed for some particular reasons. And so there was this kind of a lull time when we stepped up, we being just citizens and neighbors in this community, to again continue doing educational activities. But then in July 2000, Tammy Baldwin was now Congresswoman Baldwin. She secured a grant to Sauk County to set up what was called the Badger Reuse Committee. And here is what happened over the next 9 months. This committee got together and through an intense and well coordinated, I think, process came up with a plan, a report of the committee that the Sauk County Board approved, and that set into motion the next stages, which is setting up how do we realize this plan. And so we had an oversight commission, as we called it back then. And then by 2002, that group of leaders from across the levels of government came together to come up with the more detailed way to realize our report's vision. And that led to Sauk County expressing its support. So I'm going to go back through some of that and just highlight some of this so you get a feel for what kept dozens of us, if not hundreds of us, very, very busy for this 4 or 5 year period. Here's the first board of our little coalition. I could go on. Many of these are old friends and battle-scarred veterans of the Badger process, and we've lost a few of them, of course, over the years. I'll just mention the one. I'm sitting there in the front row at the bottom on the right of that photo on your screen. Right next to me is a fellow named Rob Horwich, who did his PhD in Madison, was a leading animal behaviorist, and he got involved because he became very interested in community-based approaches to conservation. That is not the model of top-down government bureaucracies and powerful interests telling us what to do, but communities coming together to make decisions together in a collaborative way. And so he really bonded with our group and became a big supporter. He passed on a few years ago, but was living in Gays Mills, Wisconsin at the time. So there's my notes. I did this version of this presentation for the Badger History Group a couple months ago, and so I included a lot of this kind of archival stuff because they're really interested in documenting this process. So there's an early meeting. That's my so here's the Scott Klug task force I mentioned earlier. Congressman Klug gave this process 4 weeks to try to come up with a decision of what would happen. Very inadequate in terms of giving people a chance to share their interests, opinions, viewpoints, information, hopes, dreams, fears. It was just compressed too quickly. It was not going to work when you only gave people 4 weeks to decide what had happened to a landscape over 70 years, 60, 70 years. So, but it did start the conversation, and that was a good thing. Even though the arguments were heated, it started the process of working together. Now, I mentioned those bird surveys. Here's my friend Mike Mossman. What he did, he just became fascinated with this whole landscape. He had grown up in Baraboo and had been, as so many young people growing up in this area, fascinated at the same time, sort of repelled by it. It was this big factory out there, and you couldn't get in. There was of course, secure fence around the perimeter of it. But Mike also is one of the, as I mentioned, a leading field biologist, and in particular, he's a national expert actually on the fate of grassland birds. And this is really important from a conservation standpoint. Our most threatened suite of birds in North America are, in fact, our grassland birds that once were taken for granted as common elements in our landscape. Things like meadowlarks and bobolinks, and even the upland sandpiper down there in the lower right.
Yes.
And it turns out that Badger was a haven for grassland birds. Even though it had all these buildings scattered across the landscape, the status of the grassland there was different from so much of southern Wisconsin because it had not been completely converted into intensive row crop agriculture. It was grazed actually, even while the army was using it. There was grazing going on, so it kept the grasslands intact for these birds to actually thrive. And when Mike documented that and was able to put numbers on it, it changed the conversation because it wasn't just about this or that spot in the 7,500 acres. It was the idea that we had this big open space chunk of land that these kind of grassland bird species need acreage. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the interesting stuff we did. I mentioned the farmers market. There's me and my friend David at the farmers market in Madison. On the left there, you see the painting that our friend Victor Bakhtin, an artist from Russia who had landed in Baraboo because he worked with the Crane Foundation. These two ladies commissioned him to paint this large canvas depicting the historic Sauk Prairie. The Sauk Prairie, you all probably know that term from having come through Sauk City and Prairie du Sac, but the Sauk Prairie itself historically was about a 14,000 acre expanse of tall grass prairie that stretched from the base of the Baraboo Hills down to the Wisconsin River and then west toward, as I mentioned, Ferry Bluff, about where I am here, where I live. So Victor did this painting. We hauled that painting all over southern Wisconsin for 2 or 3 years. Became a great educational tool for talking about our prairie heritage, the human and cultural and natural history of prairie landscapes. We brought geologists out. The geologists love this area because it depicts the whole history of Wisconsin geology, from the Baraboo Hills to the driftless area bluffs to the terminal moraine of the glacier. And we brought biologists out. We've had people doing restoration work on parts of the Badger plant. So getting people involved and interested and informed was really what we were doing during these years. We held panels. This was one of my favorite moments in this history of this process. We called, this is the meeting space at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center. And some of you are familiar with the Dairy Forage Center because it's a partnership with the UW. And so we called together a group of farmers to meet with conservationists and scientists to talk about what could be done at Badger Pond. This was a really positive meeting where people who had assumed that they had different viewpoints and priorities actually found that they were in 98% agreement. That conservationists and farmers and agricultural interests actually shared more in common than we would sometimes be led to believe. Oops. Lecture series. We did a whole series of lectures. We just called on everyone, and then we put together a 10-week series of lectures, starting with the geology. Bob Dott, some of you may know Bob Dott, the late Bob Dott, who was one of our leading geologists in the country, from Madison, from the UW, all the way down to premiering a film about the history of the Badger Army ammunition plant. And there were other people on this program that you would recognize. Bill Cronin was a speaker. Stan Temple was a speaker. We had Ho-Chunk Nation represented, on and on. Brought 200 to 300 people out every single Monday evening for 6 months. It was amazing that much interest we were able to generate. And then finally, that leads to Tammy Baldwin, now Representative Baldwin, securing a grant again to Sauk County, and charging us with coming up with a plan that could be, as she says here, that could be meaningfully implemented. So she understood. She was very wise to understand that it would not be an easy effort. There's lots of contention involved. But as she said in her op-ed, I'm committed to giving the community a chance to decide the future of the land, to have its voice heard. And so the Badger Review Committee came into being. Again, I'm doing this mostly for my historian friends who want to document this for them. But these were the 21 individuals representing the 21 different organizations and backgrounds. I don't know if you'd know any of these names. I'm looking at them real quickly, but we had Governor Thompson at the time represented. We had Darrell Bazell. Some of you old timers who are interested in conservation environmental work will remember him as head of the DNR back then. But these are mostly friends, neighbors, colleagues, people who'd already been in touch and discussing things, but now we had an official channel through which to work, with the goal of, again, developing a common vision for the reuse of the property that could be meaningfully considered and implemented by appropriate local, state, and federal agencies. I'd amend that now and say tribal agencies as well, because the Ho-Chunk plays, and I'll talk about this key role. We had meetings between May 2000 and March 2001, and this gives you a sense of the stages we went through. Just getting together, learning, gathering information. We did a tour together. We had created subcommittees to come up with reports. The key to this was that what you see there with November, December, committee discusses and adopts 9 key reuse values. This was absolutely essential to the process because, in fact, we didn't talk at all about who would own land and what they would do to it. We spent most of the time talking about what values would guide those decisions. And this becomes one of the key lessons of the Badger story, that unless you have a set of shared values, you're not going to be able to come to a shared vision. So once we had that in place, they became kind of filters for everyone to come forward and say, here's what I would recommend doing with this landscape. And we had dozens and dozens of different proposals. Oh my gosh, if you ever want to go back and have an interesting reading experience, let's turn Badger into a NASCAR racetrack. Let's create a state prison there. Let's reindustrialize it and make a chemical factory. Dozens of these different proposals came forward. And we were being watched. Whoops, getting a bunch of stuff on my screen here right now. There, hold on. So we were being watched. This is a letter from Tommy Thompson, actually from the General Services Administration. That's right. Saying, because what we were trying to do was short circuit the government's usual process for disposing of excess lands. They have a very formal process, and other places had gone through that. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to take our own time and do it in our own way, but we did. So this is a letter from Governor Thompson to the federal government saying, we want you to honor what the Badger Reuse Committee comes up with, its recommendations. This was written by the governor even before that process was done. So again, we had a lot of people watching us and a lot of hope that we could come to a good place on all this. So there's our Badger Reuse Committee. There's Tammy Baldwin sitting in the front row, and actually did succeed and surprise us all in spring of 2001. We reached consensus. It was a headline. Oh my gosh. And this is the actual report if you really are interested. And you could do the deep dive and read the details. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'll give you a little sense of the highlights of what we did, but also how we got there. So just a few highlights, and you'll see that I've kind of highlighted them for you. But again, this was the mission statement. Come up with you're going to come up with a common vision and consensus recommendations. Okay, well, let's go to work. But this was really key. It was as important, the process was as important as the product. So here's some of the rules we gave ourselves, that we would try to minimize and avoid any kind of voting. We try to just avoid that if at all possible. Let's talk through everything as long as we need to, and try to get everybody to come together instead of
You need anything? I'm muted.
instead of any voting that could prove divisive. So, and even on those areas where there's agreement, discussions will continue, and we'll document where those areas of disagreement are. But here are those 9 values. Again, you can read them on your own. I won't go through all of them, but the 9 values we defined for this process that would guide, that would provide the filters for deciding the future. So, I'll just highlight one or two of these. Number one was that we hoped that whoever would come into owning the land, they would continue to work collaboratively together to manage it as a single large unit. That's kind of basic conservation biology science, that the larger unit you can work with to do conservation on, the better. Clean up, value 2. But I want to really highlight value 4 here, because this was really the heart and soul of everything. That we would express this hope that Badger would be used in ways that contribute to reconciliation or resolution of past conflicts. And I see your hand up there, Dorothy. I'll come soon. Just give me 1 second here. But this was really key, because the whole story of Badger, of course, was one of painful history. It was of ho-chunk removal in the 1820s and 30s, and the taking of the ho-chunk lands by the U.S. government. It was the history of farmers being removed in 1940, more than 70 farm families removed, given 3 months to vacate their property that they'd been on in some cases for generations. Army workers who'd spent whole careers there were suddenly out of work. Environmental contamination creating conflict. So it was a landscape with many layers of conflict. And we wanted to change that. We wanted to write a new chapter that would emphasize reconciliation. And that becomes really the heart and soul of everything we hope to do. Okay, Dorothy, did you have a question? Dorothy, you may have to unmute yourself if you're, or maybe I can't.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was muted. My question was regarding value 1. In current times, how well is the property being managed as a single unit? Is that something you'll discuss?
Yeah, I'll come back to that at the end.
Okay.
That would become one of the great challenges, and it remains a continuing challenge. But let me hold that question and let's come back. If I don't address it directly, please raise your hand again. And we even came up with a general map. Again, we didn't know who would own land, but we had a general idea of what we would hope to see. This emphasis on several key uses. And so the way I boil it down is we hoped whoever would come into the ownership of land would emphasize these things. First of all, R for restoration. Restoration of the ecological integrity of the land. A, agriculture, but not just any kind of agriculture that emphasizes processes. R for recreation, recreational opportunities in the land, especially as it's up there with next to the state park. And then E, education research. So facility on this landscape that could serve all those different uses. So that became the general vision. By golly, we had a big party when the Sauk County board voted in favor of it. It was in doubt, actually, even though they had commissioned the report and assigned us, there was still some doubt that it would in fact be able to come forward. So I see the question of what happened to the displaced farmers. So the quick answer to this is the 80 or so property owners, which was mostly farmers, but also a school and 2 churches and graveyards and so forth, were given, well, it was land taken by eminent domain, but they were compensated to fair market value, they would say, but some felt that it was not fair. So there's still a lot of anger and frustration. Even 2 or 3 generations later, there was some lingering animosity about what had happened. But they were also, many of the farmers, of course, patriotic citizens who understood that this was a sacrifice for the larger good, in a sense, during the war effort. So they were given 3 months to vacate their property between basically the end of 1941 and March of 1942. And imagine this, you had to move lock, stock, and barrel 75 farms, literally move them, the buildings, the outbuildings, the livestock, everything. So it was a trauma in the community, and it was that kind of trauma again that we were trying to address in a respectful way. This just again, since many of us are university connected, just to make a point that this was drawing interest from researchers as well. These are 4 students who did graduate work, actually theses and dissertations on the process, even as it was unfolding out of the UW. So pretty amazing how much. That's Jason. He was a student of mine who did a master's on the process. Okay, I'm going to take us beyond what happened after the reuse process. Come 9/11, Badger was still in Army hands. So at 9/11, then after 9/11, the plant was closed down again, off limits to any visitors from outside because it's the U.S. Department of Defense land. And yet, of course, Badger was not going to reopen, and it had already been decommissioned. The parties went to work figuring out how to implement the work of the plan. So MOUs developed between all the entities, Ho-Chunk Nation, Department of Agriculture, on the Dairy Forage Research Center there, local governments, state governments, all of them coming together. Our alliance forming itself. Now that we kind of got over the hump, we could become a nonprofit and carry on the work of watchdogging. Again, continuing public outreach and education efforts with films, books, exhibits, events, all kinds of field trips, all kinds of things that we would do to continue getting people to come into the place and understand it as it began its transition. And I'm going to show you a few photos. One of the really cool things that was done back then was it was the Badger History Group, actually, another little nonprofit that came out of this, still doing great work, that commissioned some of our leading photographers in the southern Wisconsin to come in and document the landscape before it would go through the deconstruction process. So Andy Krashauer, who some of you may well know, was out there with his camera. Again, these are different images from different photographers for an exhibit called Behind the Fence. And here's the main production lines in the northern part of the plant. Those are 2 apple trees. Richard knows about this project. I won't get into it right now, but documenting these apple trees that were scattered around the Badger lands. It's a project that I ginned up here a few years ago. Here's Sauk County then supporting the final agreement for dispensation of the land. Again, this was a history group talk, so I'm giving all the documents they would like to see on screen. But all of this involves this extremely complex chess game. Imagine this, you've got the federal government, the tribal government, the state government, the county government, 2 local township governments, all involved in trying to make a unified decision. It's extremely complex, and it took several years to just talk through all the complexities of how to transition this land. So in the next few minutes, I'm just going to talk about the larger context for all of this going on and what helps to account for the fact that we succeeded in what we were trying to accomplish. So behind the process were several trends that I'll just highlight in my world of conservation, biology, and restoration work. First of all, there was a move starting in the 1990s toward what became called community-based conservation or ecosystem-based. There are different terms for it, but the basic idea, as I mentioned earlier, of bottom-up work instead of top-down work. So community-based conservation became a theme for many people in the professional world of conservation through the 90s, and we were trying to reflect that and build it into our work. Conservation biology itself, the field that I'm most affiliated with professionally, was a new field. Came into being only in the 1980s and was still building itself, an interdisciplinary approach to conserving biological diversity on the landscape. And Badger is a perfect laboratory on the land for demonstrating these new principles at every level, from the genetic to the population to the landscape and ecosystem. So at all levels, and this is what conservation biology helped us to see and do, to not think only in terms of species or genetics or whatever, but to connect them. Restoration ecology. We in Madison and southern Wisconsin, of course, were known globally for the work of beginning the origins of the field of restoration ecology, particularly at the University Arboretum with its prairies and wetlands and savannas. So restoration, however, was coming on strong in the 1990s as well. When Richard introduced me, he quoted Donald Worster, and I mentioned how much I felt my debt to him. And that was because Donald Worster was, in some ways, the great-grandfather of this field of environmental history that also came into being in the 80s and 90s. And again, I mentioned Bill Cronin's name earlier, a leading force in environmental history all around globally. So we had environmental history helping us to understand the dynamics of human nature relationships over time and the role that humans play in crafting what we think of as nature and vice versa. So that complicated story of human, natural, and cultural interaction.
Curt, we have a good question. I'm not sure. I don't think you've quite touched on it yet. From Lee Gasper Galvin, she asks, what happened to the displaced farmers from this area? Were they appropriately compensated by the federal government? Good question there, and I'm not sure you dealt with that quite yet. Were you planning on it?
Yeah,
I did
Richard, he did answer that one.
Okay.
Yeah,
Very good.
they were, compensated, but in some cases, apparently some people didn't think quite appropriately
Okay.
compensated.
Yeah, that's the way I remember it. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure your question was answered. Sorry.
Just
Yeah,
fill out that
thank you.
a little bit. Physically, the farmers, some of them moved to town, especially if they were older farmers and kind of nearing what we would think of as retirement age. Some of them were relocated and purchased farms nearby. Some of them changed professions. There's lots and lots of stories of what happened to the farmers and their families in the immediate aftermath. And some of them went to work at the plant. So it's complicated, the interwoven channels of history playing out there.
Sure. Thank you.
Another movement coming on strong in the 90s was the environmental justice movement, recognizing that our environmental problems and challenges are connected to our social needs and challenges as well. And this was particularly key, of course, in discussing the role of the Ho-Chunk Nation and their desire to reclaim lands in their ancestral territory. And of course, the Ho-Chunk presence in Sauk County and is strong. We're the second largest concentration of Ho-Chunk Nation members here in Sauk County. And oncoming of the field known as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, we call it, which is the idea that kind of the Western approach to scientific research is different from those that have evolved in indigenous communities, but there are opportunities to try to understand how these different ways of seeing and knowing can be brought together. And so we saw Badger as a chance for working with our Ho-Chunk Nation members to bring traditional ecological knowledge back into the process of thinking about land stewardship. So all of these, I just listed really quickly 7 major trends that were going on in, again, my professional field of conservation and biology and related fields. And Badger, all of them intersected. All of them came together in this particular landscape. So that was what was motivating so many of us is, wow, we have this amazing opportunity. And we have nearby groups like the Aldo Leopold Foundation that I've been very active in for decades. The Crane Foundation, I'll talk about this in a minute, but these are the legacies that we had here in Sauk County that helped us in this effort. So let's start with the Ho-Chunk Nation, again, whose presence here goes back thousands of years throughout Wisconsin. what you're looking at here, I think I'll come back to this at the end, but our friend, Ho-Chunk artist Melanie Talmadge Science produced this amazing mosaic sculpture installed on the infrastructure of the old Badger Army ammunition plant along what is now the Sauk Trail. But the Sauk, I'm sorry, the Ho-Chunk Nation, again, these are the ancestral lands as outlined here by the treaties from the early 1800s. Won't go into detail right now on the various configurations of native lands, but the Ho-Chunk lands were the ones that were defined under the treaties in 1829, 32, and 37, and Badger is in the middle of that territory. In fact, you see right here, you can see that map again with the land shown right almost literally at the center of their ancestral lands. We had a strong tradition in Sauk County and still do of active soil and water conservation by the thousands of private landowners and farmers. So we highlighted this, that we did have a legacy already of active conservation work. I showed this photo before of the farmers coming together to share their hopes for what could be done with Badger that would benefit these efforts. There's Aldo Leopold's, of course, story, which connects because his shack property and the Leopold Foundation is located just a short 15 or so miles northeast of the Badger lands. So Aldo Leopold knew the Sauk County landscape very well and is actually connecting, of course, his work on campus to what was going on his farm. And of course, his children carrying on that legacy through the Aldo Leopold Foundation. There's Nina Leopold Bradley in the upper left there, dear friend and mentor of mine, with another dear friend and mentor of mine, George Archibald, the co-founder of the International Crane Foundation. So this amazing legacy of conservation in Sauk County was a huge benefit for us in crafting this vision. And so I'm hoping many of you, of course, been to the Crane Foundation. But the point I want to make with ICF is that they were doing this kind of community-based approach from day one, from 50 years ago when George and his partner Ron Sowie founded the Crane Foundation. Really, their whole vision was all about working with communities to conserve cranes and their habitats. And so it became a model for so many other conservation organizations around the world. But it was in ICF's DNA from the beginning. And so many of us were kind of trained and grew up and had our careers under the umbrella of the Crane Foundation, the Leopold Foundation, and other organizations like this. So here's, for example, the Crane Foundation at work in Africa and in Afghanistan. This is how the real work. Everybody goes to the Crane Foundation, sees the beautiful birds, but this is the day-to-day work of the Crane Foundation in more than 100 countries all over the world. I mentioned Bob Hoare earlier, as I mentioned, an animal behaviorist. He's the one who figured out if you want to raise cranes and release them into the wild, you're going to have to act like a crane to raise them. They need to have that imprinting on adult cranes. And if you don't have adult hooping cranes, as in this photo, you have to dress like one, act like one, and raise chicks like one. And Rob is the one who figured out how to do all that. And from that work, he went on again to form this group called Community Conservation to carry on this work. So we again brought all those legacies to bear on Badger, but I'll just highlight as I wrap up here a few precedents to what we were hoping and trying to do at Badger. First of all, we had some examples here in the Midwest of large landscapes that we could and hoped to restore to their native ecosystems. Out in Iowa, this was actually an area of land that was taken from farmers in order to create some energy production infrastructure. It didn't work out. It became the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge just east of Des Moines. This had happened in the 90s. And if you go there now, you'll see the largest restored prairie in Iowa. Quite spectacular. I was working with a lot of groups in these years, including this one that became nationally known. This is down on the border with Mexico, actually, literally on the border. in southwest New Mexico. This group of ranchers had come together, in some ways inspired by Aldo Leopold, I should add, to say we've got to stop fighting each other all the time, ranchers and environmentalists, so we can work together to conserve large landscapes. And this was groundbreaking because, of course, these were the years when environmentalists and ranchers were fighting each other tooth and nail. But here's the area of their interest, way down there on the border with Sonora and Chihuahua. And these are my friends in one of our meetings down there. I was working very closely with this group. I'm still work a bit with them, but back in the 90s, it was a major effort and really provided a model not only for us, but for rangeland landscapes out west, all across the West, looked to the leadership of this group called the Malpai Borderlands Group. I mentioned earlier outside Chicago, the Madison National Tallgrass Prairie carved out of the former Joliet Army ammunition plant. You can go there now. Next trip you go to Chicago, take a trip out there and you will see, in fact, a herd of reintroduced bison free-ranging across the Madison Prairie. Who'd have thunk that within, again, 30 miles of downtown Chicago? But looks very similar to Badger in many ways. It was, as I mentioned, a sister plant, and the infrastructure even looks very similar. There it is, just to give you an idea of where it sits in the greater Chicago region. And here's what they came up with, a pretty complicated plan. I won't go into detail, but I used this map just to show you. They had to do some creative planning because they have major highways and other things going in and around the area there. But what an invaluable thing they were able to accomplish, again, protecting that open space and going about the process of restoration from the community level up. So all kinds of people have been involved in at Madison, and so it becomes a model, again, for a large metropolitan area, especially important model for citizen involvement in conservation. That, in fact, led to a yet larger network in the Chicago area. And I'm from the suburbs of Chicago, where I went to high school and DePaul University. So I'm well familiar with Chicago. And many of my friends were involved in the work of, quote, Chicago Wilderness. This is a consortium of more than 200 organizations all across the Chicago area, museums, the Shedd Aquarium, the Chicago Academy of Sciences, the Nature Conservancy, schools, churches, businesses, coming together to work at the regional level on biodiversity conservation in Chicago. So these were the precedents we were looking to, but a couple more just to highlight this. One of the most important places we looked was just a little west to the Kickapoo River Valley. I hope some of you had a chance to, like I am doing in that photo, canoe on the Kickapoo. This was extremely important and happened just a year or two before the Badger process started. And many of you know this story, that it was planned that there would be a big dam there because the Kickapoo River is prone to flooding, and it has continued to flood. That's another lecture. But they planned it. They'd taken over many farms, dozens of farms in the Kickapoo Valley near Lafarge. But the dam was never built because, in fact, we began to understand the Kickapoo Valley was, in fact, an incredibly important home for the biodiversity of western Wisconsin. Some very important natural areas would have been flooded by the dam. The dam was stopped, and it is now the Kickapoo Reserve, co-managed by the state of Wisconsin and the Ho-Chunk Nation. So this became really important as a precedent for the Ho-Chunk Nation working together with other entities in collaborative land stewardship. So there we go. The Badger Plan, back when we were all busy on this, was a, quote, rare achievement, but it wasn't an accident. It wasn't predetermined, but it wasn't an accident. It reflected these emerging trends in conservation science, and it reflected these legacies of Sauk County in Wisconsin, reflected the precedents and lessons that we could gather from other places, and it reflected a process that allowed the community to define and channel these shared values. And there we go. Let me do a little, I'll stop sharing my screen and just bring you up to date a little bit, since I didn't do that, I guess, in the in the whole in my PowerPoint here. But basically, the land is now divided among the Ho-Chunk Nation, the state of Wisconsin through the DNR, and the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center that conducts. It's their research farm, one of a couple in Wisconsin, but their major one because it's so close to campus in Madison. Our nonprofits, the Sauk Prairie Alliance and the Badger History Group, have continued to work with these landowners on land stewardship, historical interpretation, and championing the goals and vision and values of the Badger Reuse Plan, and helping them to work together because they're busy with their own missions and needs. So we kind of help to grease the wheels, we like to think, in terms of realizing this vision and continuing to bring neighbors and citizens into the land and to learn about it, because that's not really one of their major priorities. That's something we can offer. So I think I'll stop there because I hope there's some questions, and I know I'm skipping over a lot of the very big, complicated story, but it gives you an idea, and I hope that those of you who pass by, again, if you're heading up Highway 12, coming out of Sauk Prairie on the way to Baraboo and look off to the east, that you'll see that landscape a little differently and come in and take the tour. And maybe, Richard, it's time for another tour for a PLATO group if you got new members, and we'll get Charlie to help you.
Sounds like a great plan. Thank you. Thank you. Lee has another question for us about a place in Iowa. Lee, do you want to continue with that question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, I mean, I was just a few miles from there where I grew up, but I don't ever remember, actually visiting that. I think maybe there were signs along Interstate 80 there between Newton and Des Moines that said Neil Smith Natural Wildlife Refuge, but I didn't know what led to that being started, or, I was just curious about the history.
Yeah, and I'm a little foggy on it myself, but as best I remember, I have been there once or twice. But the acreage, I don't even know the acreage, but I'm assuming it's about as large as Badger, maybe larger. But I believe the farms were taken in order to build a nuclear energy plant. And Richard, of course, this is your area of particular interest. It was, this is back in the 70s and 80s. And so the farms were acquired by either the power company or the government. I'm uncertain on that. I'm sure it's all on their website. I'm sure there's a lot of history there that can be learned there. But once the plans for that facility did not go forward for whatever reasons, and I can't recall, then it was what would happen to it. And the congressperson from that area, whose name was Neil Smith, as I remember, said, well, maybe there's an alternative plan here. And it turns out that, in fact, it became a perfect place for demonstrating large-scale prairie restoration in Iowa, which has so precious little native prairie left anywhere in Iowa. The largest prairie remnant I know of in Iowa is about 200 acres. Imagine that. The entire state is prairie, and there's about 200 acres is the largest. So I highly recommend it. Next time you're going, it's just off the interstate highway as you're going toward Des Moines. And I really recommend it. It's a spectacular place to explore and see what can happen after 20 plus, 30 plus years of restoration work.
They have a rest area going along in that part of Iowa, showing how the soil has been abused over the decades. Fascinating little quick history and agronomy there.
Yeah, well, that's in fact so much of what this is about. In fact, let me say a word on that. Imagine this. This former military facility is now 3 main landowners. There's a 4th smaller landowner that deals with wastewater treatment. But you have a sovereign nation, you have the state of Wisconsin, and you've got a federal agricultural research facility. How do you get, what's the common ground there? What's the common, Venn diagram interest there?
Soil.
And this is one of them, is thinking about soil, food, agriculture, and environmental quality, right? So the Dairy Forage Center, again, with its main administrative building right down there on campus, just near Babcock Hall, that facility is focused as its mission on dairy forages. What goes, as I always like to say, what goes in and out of the cow, right? But we know that we all have to be thinking about agricultural systems in the larger systems context, particularly as relates to water quality, climate change, and other forces and phenomena. And there's a lot of potential now for looking at how soils have been changed by modern industrial agriculture, but how we can regenerate soils through stewardship, through different management techniques, through restoration. And is Midwestern agriculture so productive? Because we had 20,000 years of prairie soil under the plants to make the breadbasket of the world. So the potential for going forward and thinking about how we can learn together about what land stewardship will mean in this time of uncertainty and rapid change. That's where Badger can still be a laboratory. And it can involve the Ho-Chunk Nation working together with the state of Wisconsin, working together with the Dairy Forage Center. So that's exactly the kind of thing what we were hoping. And indeed, it's come true. And all these entities are continuing to work to varying degrees in various ways.
Yeah, I think we'll have to invite Allison Duff to speak to us again. She's spoken to us twice already.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
going to find out if she's able to reduce methane release from cows if they've been fed seaweed. I understand that's a way to reduce methane release.
Yeah, that's one particular technique I've learned about, and of course Allison, and I'm biased. She's a former student of mine. I was on her PhD.
Okay, good.
She is just a gem, absolute gem, and we're so fortunate. But it's so indicative of what UW-Madison can do at its best, right? Is produce students who are creative, thoughtful, and insightful. And she's got new ideas all the time. I just met with her, so I hope, she can join you again and go into some detail on some of that.
Good. Dorothy has a question. Dorothy, you want to had your hand up for a bit?
I was hoping to get a bit of a follow-up on the whole plan. At one point, I haven't actually been back to visit Badger probably in 5 or 6 years, so it's been a while. But when I was there, it was quite clear that the Ho-Chunk were making a lot of progress on restoration. The state's portion, which I think that the offices for the group following the alliance, the former CCCSP group was on, they were not really making as much progress on restoration. So how is it going as a unified whole? Is there more progress being made on the state lands? And I'm discounting dairy forage. I'm talking about the lands that are under the DNR's jurisdiction. Have they put any money in or made any efforts?
Well, I'll mention all three because we have to always be thinking of how all work together. And this isn't just Badger. This is the same in any landscape, right? And so the laboratory has certain advantages when it comes to land stewardship. They can act fast. They have their own streams of funding. They have some really talented people they can call on. The landscape itself that they have is more conducive to more rapid restoration action. So they've been making good progress, and it's amazing to see. The DNR is different because obviously a state agency has its own mandates and legal requirements. Without going into great detail, in past governors' administrations, I won't name any names, there was not so much interest in adhering to the vision that we had crafted. And in fact, former governors had crafted, and the state of Wisconsin had crafted. It was their reuse plan as much as anybody's. But certain political leaders did not adhere to it or respect it. And so we had a lot of issues. And there's not a lot of budget. The state park system, and it falls under the state park system, has limited funds and flexibility. So it's been a challenge. The people on the ground do the best they can, and they do actively collaborate with the Ho-Chunk and others. But it's been slower going. With the Dairy Forage Center, they have a different mission. Their priority is not land restoration. However, What they are really looking at is how dairy farming can increasingly coexist with restoration efforts. And I think that's as important as anything, because we're never going to be able to restore millions and millions of acres of southern Wisconsin where dairy is such a dominant land use. But we can develop techniques that can provide better results in terms of clean water, biodiversity, grassland birds, soil health, reduction of methane, on and on, all the things that we can improve in terms of our use of agricultural lands. So if we were doing a grading, if we were grading how well the partners have been working toward the vision of the Badger Reefs plan, I don't know. I'm not going to give a grade. I never like grades anyway. So there's still a lot of work to do.
Okay.
And I'll mention one last thing on this, that we're still at this, and some of us, the same people, a lot grayer now, are back at it, and we're going to work with all these partners to see if we can have a visitor center or a welcome center built up near Highway 12, so you can come and learn about all the stuff that I just went through the last hour talking about. This was part of the Badger Reuse plan originally, that all the partners would work together to create a place for visitors to come and learn the amazingly rich story of this landscape. And so we're talking to all of them right now to see what we can do on that. So the work goes on. It's a work in progress. And Dorothy, yeah, sometimes I get very frustrated that we've only done so little. Other days I wake up amazed that we've been able to do as much as we have. And so today I'm feeling okay.
Thank you. Thank you. As you know, I had a very minor part in the story. I was one of the people who carried the new display board around to various activities, including sometimes at the farmer's market, went out and under supervision cut back brush. I never really got to the point where I could actively identify various plants correctly, but it was an important part in my history too, although certainly nothing like the efforts that you put in, nor have I stayed at it. But I'm very, very interested in what happens to Badger, and I'm very glad to see the progress being made. Just the picture of all the buildings gone and greenery showing through, whereas previously I was shocked the first time I saw it when I came to Wisconsin. I wondered what that ugly structure was on the landscape. So I'm just so glad to see it coming back to life.
Well, we thank you, Dorothy, because your story is exactly what's allowed this all to happen. None of us can devote our whole time to this. For me, it's been a pure voluntary effort for 30 years, right? Because I live here. This is my community. But the story is hundreds and hundreds of people doing a little bit, contributing what they can when they can. We all burn out. All of us have burned out a dozen times on Badger over the years who have been in the middle of it. But someone else comes along and picks it up, and that's the story of Badger, is people like you, multiplied 1,000-fold, have done something very special, and we're still realizing it. We're still learning about it, and there's still going to be amazing new chapters to happen. And I will particularly mention how important this has been in terms of the work of the Ho-Chunk Nation. This is the largest piece of land. Their 1,500 acres of Badger is the largest contiguous piece of land the Ho-Chunk Nation controls in its own ancestral territory. Imagine that. It's only 1,500 acres. But as I tell my Ho-Chunk friends, I said, but the ripple effect is huge. And what goes on in terms of their work, their reclaiming of the land, and of their cultural connections to the land is as important as anything that's going on at Badger in terms of prairie restoration, and they're all connected. So there are many chapters yet to unfold here, but that's conservation. Welcome to my world.
Good. They've been using both the DNR and Badger have been using fire to suppress some of the undesired weed-like brush and encourage other prairie plants that been used pretty equally?
Well, not quite. I would say the Ho-Chunk Nation has been able to do the most prescribed burning at Badger.
Yeah.
Partly because of their capacity to do it, partly because of the way the land lays. And it's very flat. It's got roads through. It's very easy to burn. It's very easy to do large burns at Badger for the Ho-Chunk Nation.
Yeah.
DNR has been pretty active, but they ran into an issue a couple years ago. They were burning a portion of the plant that was part of the production process, and they unexpectedly came into a little patch of land that contained chemicals that no one knew about. And it's a long story I won't go into, but basically you had a fire burning there that was producing flames and smoke of colors that most people did not recognize. They knew something was up.
Yeah.
So they tried to shut it down as quickly as they could, and they couldn't because the stuff was flammable. And it wasn't explosive, but it was flammable. And that was a real kind of wake-up call. Oh my gosh, we really don't still know everything we need to know. So they shut down burning. This was a couple springs ago. So I'm not sure if they're going to be able to burn back out there this year. And the Dairy Forage Center, they'll be doing more in the future. I'm pretty confident in that. But you may come up, especially right now in the next week or two, if you're driving up Highway 12, you may see big smoke columns coming out of Badger where the Ho-Chunk especially are burning. I can see it from where I live here, actually. And so I always get a good feeling when I see that happening.
And Dairy Forage has moved some of their operations across the road that goes close to them. Is that right?
So the Dairy Forage Center
Yeah.
is a branch, for those of you who are curious, it's a branch of what's called the Agricultural Research Service, ARS, which is the main research division of the USDA. And so they're a national, they go through the chain of command all the way up to Washington. And
Right.
very complicated. But anyway, they will actually be constructing a new research farm closer to Highway 12, away from what is Highway 78 that goes along the Wisconsin
Right.
River. And this is, in my view, I don't know if it's the best, but it's a necessary thing. They have a large milking herd that's owned by the university, actually. And the manure pit for that herd is right next to the Wisconsin River. I mean, like yards. And it's just not a good idea to have a great big pit of manure right next to the Wisconsin River.
Yeah.
So this will allow them to move away from the river, which will safeguard the lower Wisconsin Riverway. And hopefully that'll be a much more efficient and clean facility. So they're due to start constructing this new facility in the next year.
Thank you. Wasn't sure when that was going to happen. Thank you for that update. Glad it's happening. Are there any other questions here? Let's see.
One from Lee there. Yeah. So Superfund sites under the old Superfund law. So government owned lands are not eligible for being declared Superfund sites. And that pertains to, former private industrial sites and such. And we're all familiar with some of those, and so it would probably have qualified as a Superfund site had it not been in government ownership. And they strive for the same goal, of course, of cleanup. And it's another interesting and deep topic of the levels of cleanup. Very quickly, the groundwater plumes that you saw on that map I showed earlier. There's been groundwater treatment happening over the years, and they've used some interesting new techniques to try to extract and clean the groundwater. It's still an issue. You will see if you drive around the plant, actually, you'll see on the perimeter and even toward town, little orange tubes sticking out of the ground. Those are monitoring wells. So they're constantly monitoring the movement and quality of groundwater coming out of the old plant. The other main issues at Badger with contamination were surface soil contamination, because they were dumping stuff. That's actually where the groundwater contamination came from, dumping and burning of chemicals used in production. Asbestos in the buildings were constructed, especially those early World War II buildings, lead paint on the buildings. Now that the buildings have been most of them taken down, they created a landfill and on site so they didn't have to transport the stuff all over. So that's in a landfill on the plant. So those were the major environmental issues. And the Army remains liable for cleanup in perpetuity. So again, it's not a Superfund site, but it may, in fact, have a higher level of cleanup protocols built in because it was a government land.
Okay. Thank you for that. Nice to have. We have a lot of little wrap up questions, and it's nice to have them answered from your wide breadth of knowledge. So that's great.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for all the hard work you've done over the years. It means a lot to all of the citizens here that, are potentially affected by, our soil and water qualities. And so, yeah, just big thank you from all of us,
Well,
really.
thank you for your interest. I see Pauline's hand up there, but let me do my little, something I always forget to do, which is to do my little pitch, if I may. I would say if you're interested in contributing and pitching in a little bit, I am, I guess, here in my capacity as a founder and member of the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance, and we're always looking for support. So saukprairie.org is the website, and donations and support are always welcome. We're a scrappy little, shoestring group, but we do have one half-time employee, and Grace does a great job. The Badger History Group also, who I've mentioned a number of times, really does great work of keeping the history alive and helping it feed into the reuse of the plant. So these are just really great people, and these are really dedicated citizens. And if you're really interested in any of the details of what I've talked about, they've got lots more you can. And if Dorothy, you want to come back out, do another day, volunteer day, we got volunteer restoration days all the time. So, Pauline, I see it. You have your hand up there.
Pauline, you want to unmute?
Nope. Did we lose her? I think I think she pressed the wrong button.
Yeah. Check one more time.
We'll give her
Give her a few minutes to come back. Yeah.
Sure. How many of you have not been to Badger? If you can show your hands or whatever. So some of you are, and this is a landscape you haven't experienced yet. So yeah, if you would be interested, you can go out on your own on portions of land that are accessible to the public, which is the state DNR land. You can go out and explore yourself, but we do tours. While we're waiting to see if Pauline comes back in, I'll say one of the real part of the story here is how over the years, more and more people have become interested in this, and it's not just for the sake of the place itself, but for this process that can provide examples to other places. In particular, the university. I work a lot. I'm an alum of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. So I've got two things coming up with them. They have a group of Department of Defense people actually who would like to learn about Badger. And then we have new graduate students arriving in June. They'll come out for a tour. And so it's been a really wonderful thing to see how the university has come to understand it as a resource for their own program students, especially with the Ho-Chunk presence there. It's become a really valuable place to learn about history of Wisconsin, especially for students who come to Madison from all over the world, right? They don't even know where they are. They just landed in Wisconsin. And Badger is a really wonderful place to orient them to the landscape of Wisconsin and a lot of its history. So that's been a very gratifying part of the evolution of this story. All right, Pauline's coming back in.
Yeah. Yeah. She may have hit the wrong button, as you suggest. Okay.
Oh, and Dorothy, you have another thought?
Dorothy's there.
Yes, I know that during the time that I was briefly involved, there were a number of people who had done at least master's degrees, if not PhDs, on the bird populations at Badger. Are there any students taking that back up, learning more about what's happening with the bird
Yeah.
population?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Mike Mossman and his original work doing the bird surveys. He's actually replicated that now 3 times, and I think this year will be his fourth. And he jokes. He says, my hearing is starting to go. I can't hear the grasshopper sparrows the way I used to. But he continues to do not only the bird work, and I should mention he and his family, because his wife Lisa and his son Angus are also very dedicated to this work, but also doing surveys of small mammals and all kinds of other things. That Angus, his thing is insects, moths. Why is this important? Is because it really helps to monitor, track, and reveal what's happening as the land transitions, as the restoration work proceeds. How do we understand what's happening? Well, by looking at these different groups of organisms, they really help us understand how the landscape is evolving and changing, and it helps to inform the decisions. Meanwhile, yeah, we've had students doing work on monarchs and on bumblebees, and there have been some students coming out and helping on the bird surveys. So yeah, again, like to do more on this. You can only do so much in your volunteer time, but I have a feeling in the long run that there will be a good, robust research agenda where we can involve lots of students in continuing to share the evolving story and learn about what's going on at Badger. Yeah.
Thank you.
Aline,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay, I don't know what happened before. Anyway, I'm wondering if you're familiar with the book by Cal Flynn, Islands of Abandonment. She's a Scottish writer. It's an excellent book, very readable. And she goes to all these places all over the world, like Chernobyl, for example, an area, she's a Scottish writer, as I said, areas in Scotland where there was a lot of mining. One place in France where after World War I, they buried all kinds of chemicals, and it's just a place that's fenced off, and you're not supposed to go there without masks because of all these chemicals and gases from World War I. And these places have been left alone and nothing has been done there, but nature is coming back. Things are growing again. The story of Chernobyl is quite interesting. People are actually living there. It had been where they lived before the problem. And so I'm wondering, I'm recommending the book for one thing.
Good.
And the second thing is just this idea that Cal Flynn is writing about, of letting a place alone and letting nature take its course and rehabilitate the land.
Well, let me offer a few thoughts on that. First of all, yeah, I'm familiar with some of those places. I did a lot of work in Eastern Europe earlier in my career, including Ukraine. And so I know Chernobyl's landscape better than I ever thought I would. And the same was true in a lot of the landscapes of Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War, when these were actually some of the, ironically, the Iron Curtain landscape was some of the best preserved natural areas in all of Eastern Europe. Same is true of the demilitarized zone in between the Koreas, where the Crane Foundation.
Yeah.
A lot of these places that you think of as not where conservation folks are going to focus on actually are some of the most important. You lead me to recommend another book and perhaps a speaker for you. And that's my friend Mrill Ingram, M-R-I-L-L, Mrill Ingram. She lives in Madison. She published an award-winning book last year called Loving Orphaned Space. Loving Orphaned Space, the art and science of belonging to Earth. And she takes on the same theme in some ways, Pauline. It's about Not taking for granted the places that just people ignore or neglect or you don't think of. And Merle is wonderful. She got all kinds of accolades for the book, and recently was one of the inductees of the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters. She's right there in Madison, and I bet she'd enjoy chatting with you all. She's a good friend and a delightful, thoughtful person. And the last thing, Pauline, is to actually give a little bit of pushback for what you said about letting nature be and take over, right? So this is where Badger offers a lot of lessons. So, for example, if we were not burning or grazing or actively doing restoration of the Sauk Prairie, in fact, it would be and is being taken over by aggressive shrubs. Aggressive shrubs, when we stop grazing, it just blows up, it just foams with honeysuckle and Russian olive and autumn olive and all the other things that the species that we brought in. And I'm not one who hates on species at all, but the value of that landscape for grassland birds that I talked about, for example, we have lost some of those grassland birds because, in particular, on the DNR portion of the land, invasive shrubs are taking over the landscape. So the kind of the hands-off, let nature be, that's appropriate, entirely appropriate in certain places and ecological circumstances. In others, it's more like how can we partner with the land as it seeks to heal itself? What can we do actively through stewardship techniques like burning to help restore not just for this or that species again, but for the landscape as a whole. So that's a really interesting question that we have long debates on in the land conservation world, of course, and some of you are probably familiar with some of that. And the Arboretum is another example of that. Some of these questions come up there. So I'm with you. Our whole idea at Badger was let's protect this open space because then it gives us opportunities to do research and get people involved in the stewardship work and knowing which places we can let alone and which places we may want to be a little more active in our intervention.
Good thinking. We've been
Good.
reading also about islands in very isolated places and how goats and rats will take over and how their eradication has allowed those islands to become lush green places again after they've been totally laid waste. So that's called really aggressive management that sometimes needed.
Well, that's part of our legacy here in Wisconsin, again, with the legacy of ecological restoration work at the Arboretum and in other places, is these very difficult questions. And there's Pauline, just to take it another step, of course, there's a whole school of thought among restoration people that says, well, there is no natural area anymore because just think of climate change. The atmosphere is completely different than it was even 100 years ago. And so you can do your best at letting a place alone, but now with 400 plus parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's all human. It's all human impacted now. And so a lot of people like to stake out positions on this. I tend to be more of a pragmatist on a lot of this. But in any case, the point being that a place like Badger, or any place really, can become a laboratory for understanding the complexities of those questions.
Very good.
One of the things that I'm thinking of, not letting things just go back to quote nature, is that we have changed our relationship with fire in any of the places on Earth that depend on renewal by fire are going to be seriously impacted unless we intervene periodically to allow fires to occur, controlled fires, because people are surrounding those areas and we can't just let fire run rampant.
Yeah, fire is, of course, maybe the great example of the complexities of this issue. So we know that fire was a natural part of the ecosystems historically, both cultural fire, that is fire set by people, indigenous folks, and others, even modern farming. Many of you, if you're from a farm in Wisconsin, you probably had grandparents who would burn their ditches every year. And it was part of the culture. But we have lost fire in the landscape. And in Wisconsin, that means we've lost, of course, a lot of prairie. We've lost a lot of savanna, that oak savanna between the prairie and the woodlands. And particularly friends of mine who have studied this are particularly interested and concerned about the loss of oak regeneration, right? Because we don't burn enough, because there's not enough natural burning or cultural burning happening anymore. So if we want to keep oaks in our landscape, we're going to have to find ways to use fire more regularly and extensively. So yeah, that's a great example. And of course, out west, it's a major crisis with what's happened with the lack of fire on the landscape and the buildup of fuel. So yeah, we're in a new era where we have to rethink a lot of our assumptions about what good long-term land stewardship involves. And but we need laboratories for it. That's why, again, I keep emphasizing that. We all wanted that Badger to become that. That was what we hoped, that we could help make this a place, not the only place, but a place for doing hands-on work that would help inform these large questions.
Very good thinking. That for me? Okay. Okay. I think we're just about wrapping it up. I really enjoyed the questions as well as your superb lecture. And
But it's a PLATO group. I always expect hard, difficult questions from the PLATO. That's my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, they have been insightful, not necessarily hard, not hard for you to answer, but probing questions that and with your experience in teaching, you can fathom the depths of the meaning behind the questions very well. So,
well, Richard, the first time I gave a talk to a PLATO group was years ago. It was in live and in person. There was about 50 or 60 people in the room at the Memorial Union. I remember this.
Okay.
And after that, I just kind of was exhausted. I said, talking to the PLATO group is like going through your PhD exam again, except this time you have 60 people on your committee.
I remember we had a guy talking about the Great Lakes years ago, and he went through the same thing. He'd written a book on the death of the Great Lakes.
Peter Annan.
Pardon?
Peter Annan.
That's the guy, I think. Yeah. And
Tim
COVID has changed all that. We used to meet at Oakwood, and now there's a certain convenience, and people say, well, it isn't quite the same. And you're right, we're not in the same room together. But today was a good example of interaction and a good question period on Zoom. Works pretty well.
Well, I agree, and I really thank you again for inviting me. And your last comment there, and this is what I'll end up with, is when you mentioned Oakwood. So earlier in my talk, when I was talking about outreach week work we were doing and lectures and stuff, I mentioned Robert Dott. Bob Dott, I see a few heads nodding, was such a wonderful geologist. We're so fortunate to have him in Wisconsin. The last time I saw Bob, he was at Oakwood on the west side. And I went down to visit with him as he was in hospice care, actually. And I was working on a book about the driftless area, and I wanted to go down and present him a copy because we included one of his writings about the driftless area. And why do I mention this? I mention it because Bob, first of all, he was a friend, and I just so respected his work and especially his making time to be a communicator, not just a scientist, but a communicator of the science. And he was gifted at that. But when we asked him way back there in 1990, whatever it was, 99, to ask him if he'd come out and do a lecture on the geology of the Badger landscape, he didn't hesitate. He says, I will be there. Just let me know what date. And I said, okay, Monday, January something, in the middle of the winter. He came and he brought in boxes of rocks and put them on the stage.
Nice.
And we had 300 people there.
Oh my gosh.
Showing up on a cold Monday night in January to learn about the geology of this landscape. And that was a turning point I introduced him that night.
Yeah.
And it was one of those moments where I said, I think we can do this. If you can get 300 people to show up on a cold Wisconsin January night,
Yeah, that's true.
rocks, we can do this.
Yeah.
But it was, just as I said to you, Dorothy, earlier, this has been a community effort for decades. Hundreds and hundreds of people bringing whatever they can to the story of changing the landscape of the Badger lands. Bob did what he could do. He offered a free lecture, amazingly beautiful, wonderful, informative lecture, and was happy to do it. And that's the kind of the spirit. I mean, that's, the Wisconsin idea at work, right? So mentioning Bob and thinking of our friends at Oakwood reminded me of that, and appreciate all that you do and have done and will continue to do. And come on out to Badger and see the place, and we may even put you to work for a little bit.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it today. And thank you all for coming in for the great discussion today. Next week, we'll hear from Terry Allenforth on evolving biodiversity. She's
Terry, she's my best friend.
Yes, I thought so.
Here's a teaser for you. I showed a picture of Rob Horwich, the guy who used puppets to raise cranes and stuff, right?
Okay.
That's Rob Horwich. Terry is now the director of that group, the community conservation group that Rob started. So you tell her next week that she's following me,
Right.
and she can pick up the story from there. So
Okay.
we're on a good roll.
Yes. But thank you again. You all have a great week and a good beginning to April.